It must be said that some people claim there is no proof of Israel Cohen writing this article or whatever it was, and in whatever mode it allegedly appeared. Since it was apparently published more than 100 years ago, it may not still be in print, so it can be verified to everybody's satisfaction, which gives rise to claims that it can't be found and must be a hoax. However, if Cohen actually said that, it occurs to the free-thinking American that the left got exposed and are trying to do what they always do: lie, deflect, deny, and cover up. The possibility is that the leftist plan is still in play and has been outed, so they do everything they can to discredit the claim about Cohen. Either way, it was supposedly read into the congressional record by Thomas Abernethy, a congressman from Mississippi, and became justification for his opposition to the 1957 Civil Rights Act on the basis that it was part of a communist plan. It still is. Anyway, he claimed he had found the quotation in a 1957 letter to the editor of the Washington Star newspaper, and thus decried the whole civil rights movement as part of a foreign communist plot. Whether Israel Cohen ever penned such a statement, or whether there was ever a book, magazine, or newspaper from which it came may be questioned by some. A case can be made for what was reportedly said if you look back to a similar time, specifically to a black man named Manning Johnson who joined the Communist Party USA in 1930. He was quite active and ascended through ranks to become one of its movers and shakers. He was the party's candidate for U.S. Representative for New York's 22nd Congressional District in 1935. However, he left the party in 1939 when he discovered that the communists were, in fact, using black Americans as pawns in their effort to convince them they were an oppressed class, with the hope that a bloody racial conflict would split America. Concerning his mindset during his association with the Communist Party, Johnson is quoted as saying,
"To me, the end of capitalism would mark the beginning of an interminable period of plenty, peace, prosperity, and universal comradeship. All racial and class differences and conflicts would end forever after the liquidation of the capitalists, their government, and their supporters. A world union of Soviet states under the hegemony of Russia would free and lead mankind onto utopia." Being an idealist, I was sold this bill of goods by a Negro graduate of the Lenin Institute in Moscow.
That should sound very familiar, since even today the Marxists are still at it, and use the same tactic to convince blacks they are oppressed by whites, so as to stir them up and shake the foundations of the country with racial conflict. Clearly, it is typical of Marxist philosophy to talk about the roses, not the thorns. There doesn't seem to be a good example through world history showing that Marxist socialism will ever herald a time of plenty, peace, prosperity, and universal comradeship when government bureaucrats are given the power to decide what will be produced, planted, or distributed to the people. Think it through. During the Soviet times in Russia, was there prosperity? Was there plenty? Weren't Russians standing in line for days to buy goods they needed? If you are old enough to remember news of the 1980s, you may have seen such reports. In fact, in the communist society, since the government decides what is to be produced and how much, and because people get their jobs because of who they know, not what they know, miscalculations and poor planning happen and people go without. So, if stores run out of something because some bureaucrat didn't plan well or didn't care to do so, store shelves went empty and the people suffered. Unfortunately, there was nobody to complain to about it, because criticizing the government could get you arrested. The government severely punished people who disagreed with them or complained, and if you complained enough you could wind up in prison or simply be made to disappear into the night. Does that sound like universal comradeship? Maybe the way Marx worked it up in his own twisted mind that was utopia, but his version of utopia may not be the same for everybody. So, the propaganda doesn't meet the reality. But, as we see through Manning Johnson's witnessing, the communists were working up a sweat trying to win the hearts and minds of people at least as far back as the early 1930s. They are still doing it. And racism is all Democrats want to talk about today. Why are socialists and Democrat socialists still pulling at this cab of racism? Think about it. Racial tension offers a tool to the communists who use it to keep Americans divided. The Democrats and their useful idiots in the press constantly blaver about slavery to keep it on the minds of blacks, to keep them believing white people are their archenemies. The New York Times 1619 Project was all about slavery. Critical race theory is being taught in our schools because the left believes it is the silver bullet for their quest to prove America is systemically racist in low-end institutions, thus creating their oppressed and unhappy class of people who might support a communist revolution. Anybody you hear crying about social justice should remember Karl Marx was the first one to coin that term. Manning Johnson shares that the goal of communist agents in the early 20th century was to cripple the black community in America and incite racial division. This division would consequently weaken the nation as a whole and provide the opportunity for communists to gain power. Isn't that why Democrats have rigged elections, opened the southern border, and said,
"If you have a problem figuring out whether you're for me or Trump, then you ain't black"?
As to his comment about crippling the black community, there may be exceptions, but take a long look at blue cities, i.e., those run by Democrats, like Chicago, which has one of the nation's worst records of crime, and coincidentally some of the most restrictive gun laws in the country. The Democrats are obsessed about slavery, but slavery in the South was Democrat-dominated, was ubiquitous, was defended, was perpetuated for centuries, and died with both the Civil War and constitutional amendments in the post-war era. The KKK was originated by Southern Democrats to control blacks. The Compromise of 1877 instituted an informal agreement between Southern Democrats and allies of Republican President Rutherford B. Hayes to settle the result of the 1876 presidential election, marked the end of the Reconstruction era, and the removal of Northern troops from the South. Thus, Democrat control over the Southern legislatures was hastened, and Supreme Court cases of Plessy v. Ferguson and Brown v. Board of Education wound up in case law. In other words, Democrats were not the champions of black Americans for many decades until they decided to dupe them, rebrand themselves, and pay lip service to curry favor with the black population. E.g., Biden's comment about, "You ain't black," under the aegis of equal treatment for all. But do they actually back it up? Not really. Considering the decades of lynchings, the separate but equal doctrine, and Jim Crow laws, there seems to be plenty of proof that they don't and never did. Interestingly, the Democrat administration under Joe Biden is still at it.